Hi, my name's Chase Crawford, and in this video I'm going through my essay for Dr. Campbell's class. The intro of my essay states that when it comes to the Spanish-American War, the debate over the United States invasion of the Philippines reveals a sharp divide amongst Americans. The early 1900s seemed to be categorized by those who defended imperialism and those who condemned it. After reading this plethora of authors and their perspectives on imperialism, it's clear that while some may have disagreed with one another, their reasonings revealed their ideas about race, morality, and U.S. destiny. While the Sherman Report, Albert Beveridge, and Henry Cabot Lodge took a clear stance with their support of imperialism, Reverend Charles G. Ames, William Jennings Bryan, and B.O. Flower held their opposing position by exposing the violence and hypocrisy that imperialism brought with it. So the essay starts with addressing the Sherman Report, which argues that it is legally and morally justified for the United States to take control over the Philippines. It portrays American rule as a compassionate mission to civilize, educate, and uplift another group of people that were otherwise deemed unready for independence and incapable of self-government. One quote that I chose from this source is found on page 6, when the author states, "The indispensable need from the Filipino point of view of maintaining American sovereignty over the Philippines is recognized by all intelligent Filipinos. Nevertheless, they recognize the indubitable fact that the Filipinos cannot stand alone." I chose this quote because it shows one of the ways that the report reinforces that American occupation is the only way the Philippines could ever become united and reach a state of self-government. The use of the word intelligent also reveals how every decision is within the bounds of America, and any resistance is seen as irrational rather than as a legitimate demand for independence. The next source I address in the essay is Albert Beveridge. He attempts to justify U.S. control over the Philippines using the Declaration of Independence, Christianity, and racism to portray Filipinos as biologically and culturally inferior and unable to hold a state of self-government. One of the quotes I chose from this source states, "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic people for 1,000 years for nothing." I chose this quote because it shows how Christianity was used as a tool to justify and sanctify American imperialism, ultimately painting the imperial conquest as a religious duty instead of an act of greed or aggression. In other words, it transforms the act of American domination into a benevolent mission. The next source referenced in the essay is Henry Cabot Lodge's speech called "The Business World versus the Politicians." In the speech, he argues in favor of American expansion and makes a point to criticize those who oppose it. The quote I chose from this source states, "From the Rio Grande to the Arctic, there should be but one flag and one country." I chose this quote because it is a clear example of his support for U.S. expansion, and it directly supports his argument that expansion was not merely about economics, but about national pride, power, and destiny. Further on in the essay, I address Reverend Charles G. Ames and his arguments against U.S. imperialism. His main argument surrounded the idea that if the U.S. were to expand, it would go directly against the nation's founding beliefs. And the quote that I chose from this source states that he read in it also a contemptuous mockery of all our highest lessons, a setting at naught of the great prophet of brotherhood, and a demand for Barabbas, poor Christian I am. I chose this quote because it left no room for interpretation about Ames' beliefs in how turning toward war and conquest went against the Christian values of peace and brotherhood. Next in the essay, I jump to William J. Bryan's writing about, which also argues against U.S. imperialism. His main argument was that imperialism betrayed Americans' founding ideals of liberty and self-government. The quote I chose from this source states, "We dare not educate them, lest they learn to read the Declaration of Independence and Constitution of the United States and mock us for inconsistency." I chose this quote because it goes directly against claims that we saw in texts like the Sherman Report. The Sherman Report claimed that imperialism would educate or uplift Filipinos, but Bryan argues against this in saying that the US would never truly educate people it intended to rule without their consent, since education would only expose America's hypocrisy. Lastly, the essay references B.O. Flowers' article entitled Some Dead Sea Fruit of Our War of Subjugation, where he exposes the brutal acts that U.S. soldiers committed during the Philippine-American War. One quote I chose was in reference to the water cure method that U.S. soldiers would use. It states that the method consisted of placing the victim on his back and pouring water down his throat until the body is so distended as to cause exquisite suffering, which is intensified by the fear entertained by the victim that his stomach will burst. I chose this quote because it reveals Flowers' main tactic that he's using in his writing to convince people of his argument. He's taking an empathetic approach rather than a religious or logistical one to make the argument that this kind of violence not only destroys the victims but also corrupts U.S. soldiers who carry it out. This allows people to see the argument from a different perspective and consider that by tolerating this kind of treatment abroad, it may only be a matter of time until we will face the same kind of oppression at home.